Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last week of Ask an Advocate. Um, Today, I am so excited. We have Reiko here from Diverse and Resilient, and we're just going to have some conversation about what they do and what's happening over at the center over there. I just want to encourage, if you have any questions, please raise your hand or um, feel free to type your questions in the chat as we go along as well. So, I guess to start out, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and your pronouns if you're comfortable, and kind of just tell us a little bit about the agency and how long you've been there, things like that.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. So great to see you. Nice to meet you all. Again, my name is Reiko Ramos. I use they, them, theirs pronouns. I am the youth and young adult advocate at Diverse and Resilient. I have been at Diverse and Resilient since summer of 2020, so sort of mid to early pandemic. And I'm actually born and raised in Hawaii. I came to the Fox Valley to go to school, and I studied gender studies at Lawrence. During that time, I was also getting involved with LGBTQ community, both on campus and in Appleton. And that's kind of my entry point into the work that I do. And specifically my interest in working with young folks who are LGBTQ also. So kind of an overview of Diverse and Resilient, it is the largest LGBTQ nonprofit in the state of Wisconsin. And we have two offices, one in Milwaukee, which is our home, kind of our home base. And then we also have this office right behind me on my virtual screen that is in Appleton. There's a wide range of programs out of Diverse and Resilient around LGBTQ health, safety, and equity. But the program that I'm in is called Room to Be Safe. That's our LGBTQ anti-violence program. And it is actually based out of our Appleton office. So all three of us here in our Appleton office are all part of this anti-violence program. And we provide free and confidential support to LGBTQ survivors of violence. And when we say violence, we tend to use that broadly. So we do mean intimate partner violence and domestic violence, things like that, that is always centered in the LGBTQ anti-violence work that we do. But we also acknowledge that other forms of violence that LGBTQ folks experience, people may not immediately think falls under the umbrella of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So for example, things like family rejection, we also consider to be part of that harm that LGBTQ people experience, as well as the types of harm that we experience in community, whether that's hate-based violence, or even accessing systems and other providers that are intended to help people, right, but may not necessarily be fully prepared to respond to the unique needs of queer and trans folks. So we can also provide support around that.
That is awesome. So could you maybe just unpack a little bit more about what your job as an advocate is there, like more specifically how that you support those folks that come to see you?
Absolutely. So I'll say that no day at DNR looks the same, right? Because our work is always centered on what survivors tell us they need. So what that actually looks like from person to person really varies. Um, but in general, we have a LGBTQ warm line. Um, and later I can go ahead and put that information in the chat. But it's a statewide warm line that people can reach out to us for LGBTQ support and resources. And it can be, anything that comes through the warm line, those can be general requests. And other times they are, people in crisis who are needing support. And we provide emotional support for folks who may be experiencing some form of violence. Alicia, I saw that you put that info in the chat. Thank you so much. And helping people access resources, whether that is, mental health providers or getting connected with mainstream sexual assault or domestic violence programs. That could be, our work might also look like helping someone access safe shelter if they're leaving an unsafe situation. And so that is one of the things that is a little bit different about our program. We're not a shelter program. So we do rely heavily on our mainstream domestic violence programs locally, and have really, fostered those relationships to help make sure that queer and trans folks get the care and advocacy in those places that they need and deserve as well. We do safety planning, and that could be around things like coming out, leaving an unsafe situation, or what types of things we put in place as we kind of navigate our everyday safety as LGBTQ folks. And what else do we do? We have a transgender name change clinic. And so one of the things that we can do is for trans folks who are wanting to legally change their name or gender marker, we can help people navigate the application process for that. We have some funds to help pay for that, and also doing accompaniment to help people if they need an advocate to go with them to file or go to a court hearing. So those are just some examples of the type of work that we do.
That's awesome. It sounds like you have a lot going on. And you seem to cover a nice wide variety of things that folks can access. Could you maybe just talk a little bit more for those who don't know what a safety plan is? Just maybe give a little bit more detail to what that might entail.
Absolutely. So safety planning is really, so we might approach safety planning actually a little bit differently than some other folks might. So I've worked with young people, like, for example, who have maybe at risk for homelessness, or either being kicked out, or wanting to, or they might have a flight risk, right? And so I've worked with folks who have a documented safety plan about like, okay, who are my safe people that I can reach out to when I'm in a crisis? What resources might I reach out to if I find myself in this situation? Um, what do I have a go bag packed? Those are all elements of safety planning. Um, it can look really differently depending on who you're working with. Sometimes people document that safety plan. But one of the ways that we frame this sort of like strategizing around our um, safety is that the reality is, anyone who is marginalized because of their identity. So we find this to be especially true of Black and Brown folks and LGBTQ folks, is that safety planning is already something that many of us already do. Um, we're always sort of assessing what risks there may be to us existing in public, always trying to navigate like things like, is that a safe bathroom to use? Could I safely walk into this bar without experiencing some form of hate violence? That's sort of the risk assessment that many of us who have this lived experience already do on a daily basis. But we don't necessarily associate the word safety planning with it. And so part of our safety planning strategy and philosophy is that survivors already have a lot of the skills and tools um, to mind their safety. And really it's our role to, just help people identify what some of those things are. And yeah.
Yeah, that's really great, because I think sometimes if you're like me, who's not necessarily, I don't identify, but I still want to be able to understand some of the things that I might not have to go through, but others do. And it looks differently than what I might have to go through. So I think it's important for all of us to get educated about those things.
Mhm.
Um, I'm wondering, what are some of the challenges that you experience as you're working as an advocate?
I think one of the hardest things about being an advocate is that we often want to have like solutions, and we want to, but like we don't have that power, right? Um, we have we have tools, we have resources, um, we can help strategize with you, but we don't always have the power to like fix or end the violence itself. And that is like a really hard thing to reckon with as an advocate. Um, and, just remembering um, that reality, it just really sucks. Um, and sometimes all we can do is be there and hold space. Um, so I would say that's one of the challenges. Another challenge is that as advocates, we're often working with people at a very like volatile time. They're in a time of crisis. And so um, we don't always get like the closure or like long-term um, sorts of relationships when because like that's just like not necessarily what a survivor needs when they're in crisis, right? It's like I need um, a safe place to stay, I need transportation to get to this place, I need um, and yeah, so I think that, those are some of the challenges of just being in this work. um,
Thank you for sharing that. What are some of the joys that you've experienced along the way?
Um, well, I think, queer and trans folks are just so resilient. And I don't want to glorify that word resilience, right? Like, I hate that we live in a world that some of us have to develop these skills of resiliency um, more than others do just to have our basic needs met. But it is true that we're a resilient bunch. And um, I also find that to be particularly true of young people. So I'm really lucky to be able to work with young folks and to be able to witness that. And one of my favorite things is um, when hear from a young person that maybe I worked with um, a few years ago through a really difficult time. And um, it's really cool when we run into each other in other contexts. And I can see how much they've grown. Um, Oftentimes I learn about how they've become change makers in their own communities. And that's just really, it's such a rewarding experience to know where they've come from and where they're headed.
That's awesome. That does sound like a very rewarding thing to have. I'm wondering what you yourself use as far as self-care, because I know that any kind of work helping people can be emotionally taxing. It can, be hard on our mental health. So, what are the tools that you like to utilize to kind of mitigate that?
Yeah, I'll say the first thing that comes to mind is I get to work on an amazing team that's so supportive of one another. Um, we, I work in a workplace where I really can bring my whole self to work, and I know that I'm very lucky to have that. Um, and that comes with the acknowledgement that not only you mentioned vicarious trauma, but we also come to this work with our own lived experience. Um, and I think work doing the type of work we do that can also um, sort of reveal our own trauma responses in ways that we don't always expect or are prepared for. But on our team, we come to that like understanding together and support each other in that. Um, in and so like some of the things that we do are um, as a team prioritizing self-care, prioritizing resting, um, giving each other reminders to do that, um, and really allowing ourselves not to burn out in that way. Um, and that is such a gift. Like my director, Kathy, um, has a several decades long career doing this anti-violence work. And she speaks really openly about the fact that she has approached this work in a way in throughout her life in a way that's not sustainable, and in ways that really have impacted her health. Um, and so that is something that she prioritizes in training the rest of our staff to, yes, be passionate about your work, but that doesn't mean you have to burn the candle at both ends. Um, and yeah, we're really sort of able to hold each other accountable when it comes to um, prioritizing ourselves and our well-being. So
That's awesome. It sounds like you have a really great team wrapped around you to help support. Um, what can individuals who maybe don't have a formal role as an advocate, how can we as outsiders, I guess you could say, um, support victim survivors?
hmm the first thing I would say is believe survivors. And those are just like two words, and it sounds simple. But there's a lot of ways that um, even when we intend to do to do that, right, that um, it doesn't always pan out that way. So, believe survivors, that also means for queer and trans folks to affirm their lived experience, affirm the lived experience of cutie BIPOC, so queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And I would say especially Black and Indigenous trans women and non-binary folks, right? Um, there are so many barriers to accessing support and receiving care um, before anyone like reaches the level of getting help from an agency or some sort of system, right? Um, and so having supportive individuals in our lives and building networks of or pods of support people in our lives is so important when it comes to both preventing and responding to violence. Um, and so um, you don't need to be a formal advocate or in any sort of formal role to provide support, right? That can be starting with listening and holding space. Um, and you can educate yourselves on what sorts of resources are available and help refer those you care about um, to those places. Um, and, even just beyond like, hey, you should know about diverse and resilient, or you should like, I heard about this person named Reiko and you get to talk to them. Like you can do things like offer to make a phone call or visit with them. To help them get connected with other resources.
I love all those ideas. Um, Alicia wrote in the chat that Kathy is the best. And again, I just want to remind everybody that if you do have any questions at all, please feel free to either raise your hand and unmute yourself or go ahead and write them in the chat. Um, Now, I know that you had mentioned that you like to work with the youth and young adults, um, particularly with the youth. Are you able to go out into the community and help educate? Is that part of your role, or is it more that folks should come and see you at the center?
I would say both. So I can do visits like this to provide education. We also, and I do outreach in other schools as well. Um, and then we also provide training for other agencies to be able to do their work with LGBTQ survivors well. Um, so, for example, we provide training to a lot of mainstream sexual assault and domestic violence agencies to make sure that um, they can apply the work that they do to LGBTQ folks. Um, I have also done training for people who primarily work with youth. So yeah, we do that education as well. And we're hoping to be able to do more of it when we can grow our team some more as well.
That's awesome. Um, So a question in the chat is, what advice or guidance would you give to someone who is trying to support a friend who is experiencing violence in their home from a parent or other family member?
Mm. specific to LGBTQ youth. Yeah, in this case, youth being a minor, or I mean, I guess no, my answer doesn't really change. So a young person who is experiencing violence in their home from a parent or a family member. Yeah, I would say um, connecting to as much community and resources as possible. Um, it is so isolating um, to be a young person experiencing that type of harm, right? And um, one of the unique things about young people is like how much young people have to rely on um, oftentimes family members, right? Or others in the household. Um, so as many resources as you can connect them to as possible um, is huge. So I can work individually with young people in that situation. Um, if this is someone in middle or high school, we do also have a currently meeting virtual youth group that I facilitate called Room to Be Youth. That's YOU, and in parentheses TH. So another great way to also connect that young person with peer support. Um, and, part of that young person's um, safety plan could be identifying other supportive adults in their lives. And schools can be a really a great place to identify those support people. Um, so yeah, but it can be tricky, right? Because it's also a place that um, that young person may also be bullied, or maybe they're not um, open about their identity um, in those other spaces too.
And I think you had mentioned before that you do help navigate the coming out process if they um, choose to do that. How can you tell me a little bit about what that looks like?
hmm Um, so I'll start out by saying I always remind um, people who are considering coming out that like you're the only person who can decide how and when and who and all of the specifics about that. Um, and that ultimately like you should have the agency to decide what that looks like for you. And so oftentimes what I'll do with folks is we run through scenarios, but because I think often when we're in this place of questioning if we're ready to share this part of ourselves with others, is we tend to focus on all of the things that could possibly go wrong. Um, and that is important, and we do need to um, be aware of what those risks are. Um, and then on the flip side, I also want people to think about like, okay, what would the most affirming possible response be? Like, can you just like dream what you would want that to look like? And so that we can, come up with ways that might be a reality. Um, Also really important to have some like backup plans. So if something were to go wrong and you need someplace safe to go, do you know where you would go? Do you know who you would call? Um, is there anyone that you would want to know beforehand so that they can be on standby when you have this conversation? And what other resources might you need to make sure you're properly supported when you do share this part of yourself with others.
All great, great advice. Um, so I know that you mentioned that you have support groups and you have you help people through the name and gender marker process.
Mhm.
Um, could you talk a little bit about your clothing closet and what you offer folks with that?
Yes, so we do have, I'll say it is currently small, but growing. Um, we just call it an all gender clothing closet. So um, anyone who is in the LGBTQ community or questioning, who's wanting to um, explore their gender expression um, through clothing and whatnot, they can come to our office and take a look at what we have on the racks, and take whatever it is that they need or are curious about. And anytime we talk about the clothing closet, people always ask, "Well, how can we contribute to it?" Um, we definitely do need to grow it so that there's more, a wide range of uh, gender expressions represented and a wide range of sizes. Um, and but the reality is we don't have a ton of capacity to like store all of these things. So we are still working that out. I would say if you are someone who is highly organized and loves to do things like that, uh, that's something we might um, accept help on. But yeah, we also have, as part of the clothing closet, we have some binders for people wanting to bind their chest. We've got things like packers too. So yeah, not things that you would find at just any clothing closet.
I know that with the pandemic, volunteering and things like that, those opportunities look differently. Do you
Mhm.
have any sort of volunteer or um, event opportunities that the community can support you with?
Yeah, um, that's a great question. We are on pause with volunteers for now until um, we're ready to have more public events. And I think some of those opportunities will naturally present themselves. Um, for example, pre-COVID, in my program, we had done a Pride Prom, which always requires a lot of volunteers, whether that's serving food or sort of like watching doors and perimeter, um, to make sure that everyone is safe. Um, so those are some of the like possible volunteer opportunities in the future, but we're just not quite there yet. I would say the best way to keep an eye out for things like that would be to um, watch us on social media.
Um, what about donating? I know you talked about like not wanting to be overwhelmed. Yeah, and Alicia just put your website info in the chat, but I'm sure that you would not turn down any monetary donation.
No, we would not. Um, that's totally true. Um, and that link that Alicia just put in, um, there is, if you want it to go specifically to the anti-violence program, you can certainly add that in the memo there too. And that's actually a really good way to support survivors. because our grant funding only covers certain expenses, and anything that gets donated to the anti-violence program through this link allows us to fund some of those survivor needs that wouldn't typically be covered under grants.
So I am going to venture to guess then that you are a nonprofit and that's how you are supported is through grants then?
Mm-hmm.
Because I know that in that situation, you definitely need community help and with money and donations and stuff that way.
Absolutely.
Does anybody have any questions? Anybody watching that Reiko could answer for you? You can just chat them, put them in the chat. So, Reiko, what else would you like us to know about your organization?
How are we primarily funded? I see that question in the chat. So our funding is primarily through VOCA and the Department of Children and Families. So the biggest chunk of our funding is going directly to things like victim services and like domestic violence funding. So I would say that's the bulk of it. Things like our transgender name change clinic, that was a community fundraiser that a bar did actually. So there's Jekyll's Bar in Appleton, and they had some regulars who they as a community decided we want to help fund their name change, and they fundraised a lot more money than they needed for those handful of individuals, and decided like, hey, we can start this name change clinic at Diverse and Resilient, so that more people can get help in this way. So yeah, that's my answer to the funding question. Beth, as far as your question about what else should people know about Diverse and Resilient, we are in, so our org is primarily a Black staff. It's so important to us that we are always centering QT BIPOC folks in our work. And that includes making sure that our staff is reflective of that. And we try to also be really aware of how our actions in community. So, we have a lot of our staff throughout last summer spent a lot of their time outside of work also protesting in Milwaukee. And one of the things is that we're not in bed with police. So, and that's something that we make really clear with folks, that our work is survivor centered. So, we're never gonna involve law enforcement or pressure you to file a report if you have experienced an assault. And that's not to say we will not ever work with law enforcement. That's something that we are able and prepared to do when it's requested very specifically by a survivor. But the reality is that we know so many people have been harmed by these systems, and it is actually quite rare for survivors to ask for us to advocate in that way.
Have you ever had to navigate that process as a support and, like, say, go to court with the survivor, things like that?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, sometimes that involvement happens also because people have already been interfaced with all of these systems even before coming to us. So yeah, we have done things like um, accompaniment in court, um, both for, someone who maybe like, um, I don't know how I'm trying to say this, accompanying, so it could be like an LGBTQ person who has um, been harmed by the criminal justice process, for instance. That could be working with LGBTQ families who are navigating custody issues. And yeah. I see Alicia's question. What do you see as the most urgent needs of LGBTQ youth or LGBTQ folks in the Fox Valley area? Trends you've observed? Yeah, so I would say the top two for me are mental health resources that are affirming and accessible, as well as housing resources. There's so many barriers to accessing safe housings and affordable housing. And oftentimes the resources available to help are not necessarily places that are both physically and emotionally safe for LGBTQ folks, especially if that is a trans person or non-binary person, or anyone who is gender diverse, because so many shelter programs are gender segregated. So yeah, if I could wave a magic wand and and I could only pick like one or two things, it would be those two.
Thank you. I wish I could wave my magic wand and just help you that way. What advice would you give to students who are thinking about pursuing a career in advocacy?
I think that really building your network and building your community. There's so many people who are passionate about advocacy, and I encourage you to build up your personal support network, kind of in the way that I described happens with our team, because there's so many people who are passionate about advocacy, and it is very difficult to protect ourselves and our time and our own well-being in this work. That just like find your movement people, and really rely on them for support, because that's what makes this work both effective, rewarding, sustainable, all of those things. And Do we keep a list of affirming mental health service providers in the area? Or if we referred someone to you all, could you connect them with someone you trust? Yes, we certainly can connect them. We don't have a formal list that we keep running or like documented anywhere. Much of it is in my brains and Nick's brain. Uh, but I'll say off the top of my head, our favorite uh, place in the Fox Valley to refer people to is Us to Behavioral Health in Appleton, and they have a great team and great model of just making sure that people who are furthest from justice can access both affordable and culturally competent mental health care. So we like to send a lot of people their way. Other questions that folks might have in our last little bit together?
It looks like Alicia put the link to their website also in the chat, so go ahead and check them out as well. Yes, please put your questions in the chat, or if you'd rather just private message me or Alicia with a question, you can certainly do that as well.
While you all are thinking of questions, I say another thing that I would want to, I touched on earlier, but maybe just want to reinforce is that we are a confidential resource. And I find that particularly important to communicate to people who are students or on college campuses, because it can be so difficult to find confidential resources. And so, yeah, just know, oh, we were talking about pet interruptions earlier. That's my friend Kunga. But yes, confidential resources, just want to remind folks that we're bound by state statutes around confidentiality. And so just know that you do have other options for confidential resources if you need to work with an advocate and aren't entirely sure how to access those types of support on campus. Are we still holding adult social or support groups? Not currently. We did for a short period of time during the summer. We're starting to feel like, okay, we can meet with some mitigated risk. And by the end of July, we decided we actually do still need to put a pause on it. We're hoping to bring back more in-person adult programming again by the start of the new year. And then the other thing we're looking at before the end of the year is some sort of support space, specifically around the holidays, knowing that it's a time that a lot of queer and trans folks are needing extra support. There's a lot of forced family time, as well as for many of us, maybe we don't even have that type of connection with our families. So in the past, we've called things like this fortify before, oh, I don't remember it, but basically about like fortifying queer and trans folks as we enter the holidays to help create a space for that type of connection and support. And also, you know, create our own joy when it's not served elsewhere. So you can stay tuned for more information about that in the next month or two.
Is your center open to the public, or do you prefer that folks call ahead or make an appointment?
Yeah, so we do have our sort of like open building hours are generally Wednesday through Friday from noon to 6. We're working outside of those times, certainly available to folks outside of those times. But that's kind of what we've decided are our static in-office, in-person hours. So you can stop by. I'll say if a pro tip, if you notice this flag is outside, behind me as you're driving by, if it's out there and waving, that usually means that we are there, we're in person, we're welcoming visitors. I would still say, however, it's still probably best to give us a heads up if you're coming beforehand. That way we can let you know that, like, yes, someone will be available. So that you're not also just stuck at diverse and resilient waiting for one of us.
And also, don't forget to check out their website. What other social media platforms are you all on?
So I would say the Facebook one is probably the most so Facebook, which Alicia put in, no, maybe it's not there. Oh yes, it is. So the Room to Be Safe Facebook, that is probably the most updated. We also have an Instagram account that is Diverse and Resilient Appleton. So those are but anything on the Facebook is generally going to be on the Instagram too. So those are the two that are specific to our Appleton office. If you are curious about diverse and resilient happenings in general, there's also a diverse and resilient Facebook and Instagram page as well. And that one will have more Milwaukee specific information as well as kind of statewide things.
And I believe you have a video too on our UWO Women's Center playlist on YouTube. So if you go to the Women's Center YouTube channel, you can check out Reiko talking a little bit about diverse and resilient as well.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, we just have a few more minutes left. If anybody else has any last minute questions.
Can I ask a question if no one else has questions?
Absolutely.
I'm wondering from students, what are some of the biggest barriers you see on campus for LGBTQ survivors?
I can share a little of what I've seen. So I attended an art school where it was I went to Milwaukee High School of the Arts. So it was very diverse, very welcoming to equity and equality. However, when I came here, it was the complete opposite. It was almost as if they had to create their own space. And that's something that I didn't really see in high school because it was already, it was already, I don't know how to explain, but it was already diverse, they're already part of the group,
Yeah.
However, here, I see very little of that, of everyone having their individual group, there's no unity. So I feel like the more we work on uniting those different types of groups, the less barriers we will have altogether.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Are there spaces on campus that folks have found better for that type of connection than others, or more supportive?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have the LGBTQ plus center, resource center here. We have the women's center here. And then pretty sure there's other organizations around the university that are inclusive as well. And I'm sure they do use them. And like, for example, here at the Women's Center, we get a lot of students who come in and just stop by to say, oh my gosh, this is an awesome space. However, we don't really see their face often. So, you know, even though we do get good feedback in some way, we would like to see their face often if they do want to participate in inclusiveness and unite again, you know?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing that. I see Alicia has also mentioned again, more access for confidential advocacy and more options on campus. Yeah, so neither the LGBTQ Resource Center or the Women's Center are confidential. So not just confidential advocacy, but culturally specific confidential resources, right? Because we know that if like queer and trans folks feel safest at the LGBTQ Resource Center, they're way more likely to talk about the harm that they're experiencing with the awesome folks who run the center than they are to seek support from and someone who is a confidential advocate on campus, right? Awesome, that's a great suggestion.
And I just want to reiterate again that if you are seeking a confidential advocate, that Rayco and the folks over there are confidential and confidential. And someone asked about what about students from Fox or Fond du Lac? Alicia, maybe you can answer that question because I am not sure if Gabby is the only one for all folks.
Yeah, so Gabby serves all 3 campuses, but I think there are unique needs for students who are at Fox and Fond du Lac. And so a lot of our prevention to date has focused on perhaps some of the risk or prevalence related to residential spaces, but given we don't really have residence halls, I mean, there are some apartments, of course, but I think there's just a different set of needs that we are still trying to understand so that we can create and provide specific prevention programs that meet the needs and are tailored to the needs of students at Fox and Fond du Lac. So I don't know if Ivy or anyone else wants to share. I don't know if Devin is still on. You're welcome to drop it in the chat or audio. Ivy is a student assistant at the intersection in Fox, which is why I'm calling on Ivy.
So I guess could you just repeat the question for me so I can kind of 1000% understand what I'm answering, and then I feel that I can probably speak on it a little bit more.
Yeah, just like if you can highlight what you see or perceive as the needs for students at Fox and Fond du Lac, or you can speak to Fox since that's where you're at, in terms of prevention around sexual and interpersonal violence.
Okay, yeah, I think a lot of it is just coming down to what are the resources in the community, because we're kind of these satellite campuses. We don't have students that are living on campus. So being able to connect people with those places. Another thing that I see is just really understanding what that transportation system looks like for students coming and going from school. And I think, like, for myself, I don't live at home, but I know that there are a lot of students that are still within that family unit. So, like, how do we keep individuals safe when they're still within that household? Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that, Ivy.
I would just also like to add that any of the students here, if you're interested at all in sharing your perspective about our prevention and advocacy services that we do have, and what you would like to see, you are all welcome to join the student CCRT team, because that's what we do. And you can either email myself or Gabby to get on our list, and we can send you all of the meeting information. All right, so I want to be mindful of everybody's time, and we went a little bit over, but it was such a great conversation. And again, Reiko, thank you so much for joining us today. And if anyone missed any part and they want to rewatch it again, it will be, we did record, and so the recording will be up on the Women's Center YouTube channel. And yeah, thank you so much, Reiko.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.